whawhalahia tu ke tau tolu ke he mga hua whiawhinei, whakau e hakwaliu ke whalewea whoki. Ke lata e me veheanga ke waaki, my Tagata Pulotu seminar series. Just a few housekeeping rules for us today. Make sure you mute from your end unless you're taking part in the discussion later on in the Q&A. And also to type your questions in the chat there on the bottom if you have any questions for our Reverend afterwards. Kai moha ia matau matakainanga ki he whangia ki hatau tolu whalawhalaanga ki he māmai hau nei. Tuku atu ki he hatau tolu matuka whakawhikau ko Reverend Inga Mokole ki he whangia hatau tolu ki he riongi. Whakaue.
Munu tangaloa e whakalofa he tua ke lata ia moe hawhangianga he hatau tolu a whakawhituyanga. Ka whisia niue, ka whisia niue. Ka whisi e Tagata Pulotu mai whanua ngalo. Ke whina ngalo he tua Psalm 33. Give thanks to the Lord with harps, sing to him with stringed instruments. Liongia tau tolu. Ko koe ne tu whungasia e tau mena osi he lalolangi koe a tua. Ko matala mai e whisi he pua moi hawa tau tu whungasia ke kamata ki a mautoru ki ha whiawhi. Tagata Pulotu a niwe whikai. Ko mahofi mai e hana manongi whiawhia ke uwhia ai e ka whisia niwe. Koe tau lanu whoki kua wangaha kua laonga mai koe atua ke he furufurola he hawa tau tu whungasia. Kia kamata mautoru ki ha whiawhi mo hingoa hao Yesu Keriso tunga ia mo manongi mo matala mai ke ha mautoru tau Pulotu. Amen.
Amen. Whakauela.
Monuine halamaka tau toru ki ha whiawhi mai o. Pia mo.
Aia, oi turo. Ngā honei, manako au ke whakawhaliwea atu, ki a tau tūru osi. I would like to introduce to you for Tagata Pulotu Seminar number 2. Matagi Jessop Vilitama is the Mission and Leadership Presbytery Minister for the Georges River Presbytery New South Wales Act Synod. He is a Niuean from the liquid continent Oceania. Matagi served in culturally and linguistically diverse CALD. Congratulations in the past 12 years. He is a former chairperson of the Niue National Conference, currently the advocate for being a multicultural circle of interest of the Uniting Church Assembly. Matagi is passionate about cross-cultural ministry and loves all things atheistic. Art and design was his background before entering ordained ministry and still enjoys dabbling in the creative space. He is also a writer. He composes Niuean cultural and worship songs. Matagi is an advocate for Wangahau Niue and cultural identity. He is the president of New Australia Wangahau Association, NAVA, and he is also married to Joanna Sisikefu, and they have 6 children plus 0 adopted ones and growing a brood of grandchildren. Whakauelahi, tuku atu e mga honei ki hatau tolu, matua whakawhikau ko Reverend Dr. Matagi Vilitama.
Io, langa,
You're
Reverend.
on mute, Matagi.
Yes, please.
Well,
Langa,
well, firstly, I was just saying that the computer sometimes do not do justice to what you write down because it oftentimes autocorrect. It's supposed to be culturally and linguistically diverse congregations, not congratulations.
Oh.
just want to correct that first and foremost. But for mua, tu watu e tau nawa mo e tau whakaue ki mua hia tua, ha koe tokanoanga nei ko mai ki tau tūru ke whiriweia. O e whoki ke hiririfu ko Tukumai, ko wina ke whakamatala au ke he mama heaho, hangawi e ke he hako tau kumukumianga. Whakamua whakaue ki atua, mai longa e tau tōru, ha tau tōru tau tupuna, tau pēnina, si ki hia ni ki tau tangata mutu nei, mai whanua nei ne nofu mai wanga hawa atua iau. I firstly acknowledge our Creator God for life and the gift of life, the gift of family and community. Also acknowledge our tupuna, our pēninas, those who have gifted us with a special and unique taonga. I also acknowledge the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land I stand and speak on today. I also acknowledge all of you who are listening to this webinar, and I look forward to the engagement over the next hour or so, and the questions that you will be asking. I apologize in advance if I don't answer some of the questions or some of the expectations, but I am delighted to have an opportunity to share with you some of my findings. I must say that to share with you over 107,000 words in half an hour, I will not be able to do that, but I will indeed try to find bits and pieces of the information I think important to share today. Firstly, just as a background, as context, here in Australia, church attendance in 1950, about 44% of the population attended church. That's in 1950, 44%, well, at least once a month. In 1970, it went down to 35%. In 1980, down further to 27%. In year 2000, the attendance of the Australian population, church attendance went down to 20%. The last NCLS survey, 2016, it went down to 16%. Just imagine that from 1950, 44% of the population attend church, and 2016, only 16%. Now, the trend of Pacifica people follow a similar trajectory. We also decline in our attending worship services or churches. Niueans, there's an estimate, there's no accurate figure. Ai mahino mitaki ni mara niue na North Australia hako mena tohia tau toru tu tangata Nuhisifa. Okay, but I think the estimate is around 5,000 Niueans in Australia at the moment. And out of that 5,000, I was the president of the Niue National Conference in the last few years. I finished last year. But what I found was that not many Niueans attend churches, only a handful of people. And those who do attend are often those who are Niuean born, or some are New Zealand born. The second and third generation Niueans do not attend, or hardly do, unless they are told by their parents to go, which is the story of the second gen. And only those also who are hungry for their identity, their language, and their culture. They find a home in the Niuean church. But a lot of Niueans attend social events, regardless of whether organized by families or churches, congregations. And so one of the things that I noticed over the years, not only here, but also in New Zealand and also in Niue, that a lot of leaders do come from church backgrounds. So churches are producing community leaders, particularly in diaspora, because Niuean diasporic churches are the custodians of the Niuean taonga. And that's a fact, no matter how much we argue against that. If you note those who are leading communities, we do have leaders who come from churches, and there's something there. So our taonga is only as strong as the traditional Niuean churches are strong. Kalau lelo ni tuanga e eklesia o tau Niue ne po whakataha ki ai, sipihia ni tuanga he mga hau mo tau whare tau taonga ha tau tūru. So we have churches who created and established language classes, language schools, organize cultural singing and dancing practices, and so forth and so forth. So it's a village in diaspora. So churches are villages in diaspora, really. And we need to recognize and acknowledge that and use it to our advantage. Yes, we do have congregations, where we do have organized institutional language schools. Those who do whono, communities, onono ki ai koe laulahi he tau whakapuanga whakamotu, Tupumaiaga he tau ekalesia ha tau tū. And I think someone, I marked the paper, a master's thesis from New Zealand last year or the year before. It was to do with language and church and singing in church. And it was also very evident in that research paper that that's the case. So spirituality has always been and will always be part of the Niuean psyche. It's inherent in our Niuean or Islandic DNA, even before Christianity arrived in the islands. So our language, our etiquettes, our culture, and everything else is undergirded by our spirituality. Now, this is Niuean spirituality, traditional indigenous spirituality called Christianity. So inherently, we are spiritual. And a lot of things that we use as part of our identity, like language, for example, songs, dancing, and so forth, are spiritually based. They grow out of that essence of being a Niuean. You are a spiritual being. But when we colonize, we neglect that spirituality, that yearning in everyone's heart to reach out to something beyond ourselves. So I'm not just talking about colonialism in its traditional definition, but also our mindset, our way of being, our mind whenever we travel, whether places we go, we are occupied by a mentality that's not really ours. We adapt to particular contexts. And so we change as we go. But my challenge is to find and to look back at my roots and ask myself, who are we? Now, I don't say, who am I? I don't ask, who am I? Because I tend to bend towards the Western definition of identity, but I ask, who are we? So the purpose of my thesis was to construct an ecclesiology for a Niuean church in diaspora. Now, the kind of ecclesiology that we do follow oftentimes reflect what we experience back in the islands. Tamai ne lotu po ke tapu niue, se riuni tō whakafō ke motu nei. Wherever we go, we try to transplant it, the type. But we also need to be mindful that type of ecclesiology was not contextualized, indigenized as it should have been in my reading. Hape Hatotola lotu ka ha mai to missionary. Si longa foki the men of phone ne kwa for kiselo to they were introduced as part of our culture. Now they are a part of our taonga now, but we lost a lot of our traditional indigenous taonga. And there are glimpses of that still with us in song, in chants, in dance as well, in speech. But how do we in diaspora recover some of those received traditions and parts of our identity as Niueans? I think we do it much better overseas because there's an intentionality in finding ourselves once again. In Niue, everyone takes it for granted. There's this yearning and longing that forces us to hold on to those traditions and to those the culture, to our identity. So we do have that extraordinary drive, if I say so, to hold on to what we have and actually recover. So part of my thesis is to construct an ecclesiology that also consider some of those aspects. And one of the things that I did in my thesis was to replace a traditional image of the church, which we use tunge ekalesia. Ekalesia is a Niuenite word. It's a Greek word to say it is a fellowship or congregation. So Niuenite it to ekalesia. The word that I use in place of that is Tukuitonga. Mai Tupumaiaga he kupu whakawhetuyanga. Now, we can say Tukuitonga is a proper Niuean word or a neologism, the kupu tause, with the havala he kupu. Now, whakawhetuyanga, whaka is a prefix, anga is a suffix. Even whetuyanga, ka manamanatu ye, fe is still a prefix, tuyanga. And then the core root word is tui, and it involves pain. It involves pain, it involves a craft, bringing together, binding together something, two pieces or more together. Now that involves pain. Now, if we imagine being a church or being a congregation, there's a lot of sacrifice, a lot of pain involved in that exercise as well. So Tukuitonga both carry those multiple meanings. In my thesis, I kind of spent a lot of time and the etymology of that particular word. So that exchange represents a linguistic and cultural shift. But what does it present? What does it mean, Tukuitonga? Tungani loi to tūru ha Tukuitonga, koe whakawhetuyanga to tangata, mga whaoa, ekalesia, maanga, tolonga, me ko mai whalataha, whetui whalataha, ke moe mena ni ngoa taha. Loto taha, manatu taha, panako taha, ke kau whalataha. Tukuitonga hua ka kau whalataha. And I think, in a sense, when you think about the theology about being a church, go back to Christ, who established the church, who founded the church. Now, the joy of following Jesus Christ comes with the pain of carrying your cross. Jesus died on the cross; he suffered, and because of that, we also do experience that. No good thing comes without a certain kind of pain that's involved. So to have a community who is together, marolo mitake te whakawhetuyanga, na hahaia I te whakauka moe tau kawa, moe tau mamahi, me hauwhalataha, moa atu me lo tūri tau te kitaki, me lauri whamaopopo, tunga ni tau hau tau tūri, te kitaki tau tolanga vehi. There's a lot of perseverance we all need to endure as leaders in spaces of community to ensure that we have a community that are together, they're united. So that's a kind of conversation around that word that I have used to replace or to use alongside ekalesia, because ekalesia, we're not going to be able to get rid of that. It's just become part of our taonga now. But an alternative Niuean, ko kupu Niue ko fitui in Niue, ko fituiang Kirisiano. And so the purpose of my thesis is to explore how that traditional and received experience of Niuean community can be transported to different places wherever we go, that we carry that with us. So what kind of churches are we trying to plant and perpetuate in diaspora? Are we just going to plant a Niuean church in Australia and New Zealand? Or are we going to grow, being mindful of our received taonga and all the gifts that we have lost some of them, we need to recover some of them, and we identify ourselves as a Niuean church. Now there's a counter argument. People will say that now church is supposed to be non-cultural. I say that's rubbish. There isn't a church without culture. That every church carries a culture or being carried by a culture. Jesus, in his incarnation, had to be contextualized, indigenized into a Jewish culture, and used the language, the epistemology of the Jewish people to present the gospel and to embody the gospel into the particular environment. And as the gospel journeyed throughout East Minor and Asia Minor and the rest of the world, it also needed to adapt and to be transplanted and to take root in the local soil. And what I'm saying is that for us Niueans, it is important for us to contextualize the gospel in the church to be authentically Niuean, at the same time do not lose the essence of what Christ had come to bring. I think if you read Revelations, the book of Revelations, it speaks to the multicultural nature of heaven, where a place where many languages were spoken and many songs were sung. Acts chapter 2, the story of the Pentecost, speaks of the same experience of the multilingual celebration of Pentecost, where the gospel is received in different languages, and we are to proclaim that gospel also in our particular unique culture and language. And so in diaspora, we're not going to assimilate and lose our particularity and our uniqueness, but we are to use that as our gift to others around us. Just as an Asian will provide, or Chinese or Filipino will provide their particular brand of Christianity or faith to us, expressed in a particular vessel that is particular to a particular culture. I think we do need to offer one another these special colors and hues and flavors of what a Christian community is supposed to be like. So my study is very, it's basically a Niuean study, but it's also basic enough that would resonate with other cultural ethnic communities. So the study is about the practice of what is involved in being a church, language, culture, how do we express ourselves in diaspora. This coming Saturday week, I'm organizing a Presbytery multicultural celebration celebrating 44 years of the Uniting Church for the whole huge area of Jordan's River. We are gathering together and celebrating God and faith and community in different languages and dances, performances. And that's just to showcase who we are uniquely from different places, different cultures, but united in Christ. So in my thesis, there are distinctive images that I use to characterize what a Tukuitonga Kerisiano looks like. And I explored through the lens of liquidity by using the umu hermeneutic. Now, the title of my thesis is on becoming a liquid church. On becoming a liquid church, singing the Niue Tukuitonga Kerisiano on a distant shore. So liquid church is something that is quite new, but it speaks to the very fluid nature of modern culture. It was first coined by a philosopher, European philosopher called Zygmunt Bauman. He defined postmodern culture as fluid, as liquid. Nothing is ever permanent, is forever evolving, and it's very quick as well. I mean, just have a look at the way we use social media. You have people on social media changing their pages and changing identities. Sometimes you don't recognize who they are, the way they post, the way they speak. But when you meet them in person, they're very different. So we do live in a very liquid, fluid culture. So my reference to a liquid church is not just about the way culture is happening, but the very nature of Jesus' ministry in the New Testament. He was very liquid. He was very fluid. He was never in one place at the same time. He didn't use the temple as a place where he would go every Saturday, in the culture of the Jews. But he did ministry everywhere. Everywhere he went, it's about church. So church is not fixed on a particular monolithic and institutionalized place like the temple or the church building, but it happens everywhere. And so my idea of liquid church revolves around the image of an umu. So the umu, for me, umu church is really, really important because I think it looks at the space, explore the space of the sacred spaces that we find in Niue. In Niue, like every other places, there are particular liquid sacred spaces. Tonga e tō Matawhaitonga, tonga e tō Walatahi me whono, tonga e wharuwao me kua whono e mea ke whakahanoa ki ai. So traditionally we have sacred spaces. So Mircea Eliade, who is a sociologist, anthropologist, speak about sacred spaces. And one of the things he spoke about is that the sense of sacredness we carry, the meaning, we place meaning on things. They don't just become sacred. They become sacred because we human beings say it is sacred. And so for us, in my estimation, in my thinking, sacredness is defined by us human beings. We are created in a sacred image of God, and so wherever we go, Jesus said, whenever 2 or 3 gather in His name, there He is in their midst. So for me, in a village, Niue, koe oho manga, I loto he manga, koe roto ho tonu hai e whaitunga, whahe whaitunga, whaere a kwako, hai e whoki koe mare. So that's our sacred space in terms of our tradition. Koe tō kalakalakaina mo ia, he manga, hai e te tūru no whanga, te tūru koe tō tangata. Even in our homes, in our house, hai roto whare. Ko roto whare, it's a kind of a sacred place where family will gather, pray, be together, fellowship, socialize. Now you go to the kitchen, which is behind, almost behind, although the architecture is changing at the moment. Now the kitchen and the fire are kind of one now because it's a place of fellowship. But traditionally in Niue, where fire had over, where Melakota, where Agasava, who made the fire and so forth. Kakitua had the fire, he fire with Beto, or Beto at the Hang. Now that's it's the opposite of a sacredness. Ke tolanga veve, ke tumianga do veve, ke tumna kiva, hayao se mutum. To me, the shift of that space from the center, the heart of the village to the back of the village, at the periphery of the village, is seen as nakiva or tuaya. I think in Tongan, tua means back, behind. Samoan, the same thing. For us, exactly the same. Ketomeni tua. In fact, for me, that space is sacred. Why? Because it's a place where hierarchy is not recognized. I remember serving in Niue as a pastor in Abaseli. In the village, in the church, I'm respected because I carry that title of a minister, a representative of God in the village. And so, but whenever I go to Fayumu, that title is gone. I'm just one of the people there, and I was approachable. Any Tom, Dick, and Harry come and talk to me, and we joke around and we laugh around, we do things. Now in church, not everybody can come up to me. There are certain people who are kind of allowed to come, but not everybody. Even though I say I'm free, anyone can come to me, come and talk to me in church. But people kind of have that space. But in the context of the umu, there isn't anything like that. Anything goes. The hierarchy dissolves, and everyone becomes one. And I imagine Jesus in that space. That Jesus with the tax collectors, Jesus felt at home with these people. Now, our culture provides that space that I call church. I call that space church because when Christ is proclaimed, there are a lot of things that we teach in that space. Now, familial connections, in that space, we get to know and learn, teach our children our genealogy, our family. We teach children our sense of generosity. So these are values that we teach in church, that we enact and we embody in the context of the And if we are intentional of understanding the space as a place of being church. I'm not saying church in a classical sense where on a Sunday morning for an hour and a half in a particular place. I'm not talking about that. The definition of church is the body, the people. It is the people, not the place. And so whenever people gather together and live out their faith, that's church. And to me, identifying the space as church, and if we are intentional in doing that, in having that space as sacred because of the presence of the living Christ, and because of the practice of his teaching, all in our values and Niuean values and etiquettes, then we are authentically being church. Now, the hermeneutic that I use is that using the lens of a to read history, to read the Bible, to read texts and narratives, that's how we should read rather than doing what we're doing right now as being taught by the Western culture to be individuals and read what you can and interpret from your own individual perspective. What I'm saying is that we as a community need to read together. We need to interpret together. We need to use the lenses of a community, the Umuhe to read our history. Who are we? And how do we do things? And so we look at the inner geography. The inner geography speaks about not just the fact that we are mobile people. John Connors, who is a professor here in Sydney, who visited Niue many times, written reports. He believed that Niue has a migration culture. We have a migration culture that's kind of built into our being now. We're very transient. We're very transient people. So the inner geography not only speaks about migration as Niueans, back in the days, Niue was an isolated island, unlike other islands who had different or small islands scattered around where they could paddle the canoe or sail across to another island. For us, there isn't any island close to us. And so we are stuck. And the first chance we got to be able to travel, you read history that we went in droves. Our young men went in droves to work guana fields, banana plantations in Samoa, to our detriment. When Bully Hayes came around, because we are so wanting to go, a lot of young people just jumped to the opportunity and went. And so we experienced that as Niue. Now, even when we look at our statistics back in Niue, only twice that Niue population peaked at 5,000, one in 1910 and another one in 1965. Only twice. We've never gone beyond 5,000. And every time we kind of peaked, people travel. 1965, 5,000, and 1970, when I found out about it, and we've grown overseas over 20,000 people in New Zealand and over 5,000 in Australia. Although that number is coming down now because we are go with Tonga, Niue, go with Samoa, Niue, go with Fiji, Niue, go with Maori, Niue, go with Palangi, Niue. I said to the rugby league people here when they introduced themselves, I said, I'd like for you to say, I'm a Niuean Tongan, I'm a Niuean Samoan, I'm a Niuean Maori. After all, you're playing for Niue. Take some pride in being a Niuean. But being a minority oftentimes, is a disadvantage, and people identify themselves with a much bigger island and much more prominent culture than Niue. But we are losing numbers. Now, let me come back to what I'm talking about, inner geography. It is not just about traversing the world, a physical, geographical world, but it's also about who we are inside as Niueans, as Christians. What is it? What makes us? And how do we continue as Niuean Christians? And how do we build that identity as Niuean Christians? Now, it's easier for other Pacific neighbors to maintain their particular identity as Samoans, Tongans, Fijians, and others because of the numbers and also because of the social structures. Excuse me. The Samoans have a Matagi social structure. The Tongans have a monarchy, nobility system. They're more hierarchical. Therefore, wherever you go, it is strong. For Niueans, we are a cephalous, egalitarian structure, which means that you are a king in your own household. But we do have a Mangawhau system with a Leveki Mangawhau as head, but not strictly hierarchical, because that Leveki Mangawhau can be challenged. And so we do have that kind of holds us together, but we lost that as well. I think it was a sociologist who came to Niue one time and wrote his book, and he said that in his summary, that the Niueans are, well, it is partly comic, the Niueans are the Palangis of the Pacific because of our nature as Republican, the way that we do things. And so even our monarchy, for example, Patuiki, he was in a Patuiki in a sense. Tukuitonga hai Tukuitonga po Vilitama. Patuiki, our king was is not a political, does not have political status, so to speak, but have a priestly function. And using his wise counsel for the people of Niue. And it's not doing your priestly function, then look out, run for your life, because they will kill you. So that's the difference between the Niue monarchy and other monarchies, is that it has a priestly function. So even in that, that hierarchy, we are very, very different. So we are, I guess, social strata ke taufia eto menaya. Ko lotu ni e mga hane ni Feilo ke taufi e whauru he tau koroia hatau tō. Another aspect of exploring through the lens of liquidity are the synesthetics. The synesthetic effects is all about engaging all the senses of individuals and community. Ko te tōru ke tōni we, piewhungu me toa me wharu atu motu. Fia the tōru ke tōra longa, fia ke kōri, fia ke tō mana pia. But for us, since the colonial time, since the missionaries arrived in Niue, we were taught to sit still in church, to be silent, to be quiet, and only to sing when we are told to sing. Now that goes against the grain of who we are as Niueans. Now we are very physical. We use our aesthetics, our senses, every part of it. So it's all about engaging all our senses as a community. So we should never discount the effect of singing, of dancing, and other forms of physical aesthetics that moves the spirit to grow one's faith and to grow one's ability to engage the community. So Niueans are very physical in our practice of faith, yet in church we sit quietly. Now God wants the best of us, spiritually and physically, and using all our senses. So the theology of the umu becomes important in this sense, because the umu event as church engages all of our senses. So in our communal preparations, for example, we practice all these values I spoke about before. We tell stories, we affirm familial connections, we fight around the umu, we fight, we make up, we pray, we sing, we dance. I remember growing up around the umu with Tukuitonga Pikihesi, Wigifana, Tongafana, these or Ma'al of Lake, or Yohane Kariki. All these people, I used to listen to them, and a lot of stories they shared, I still hold very hard, close to my heart. Hakwe to tala do ia he manga, pieni me to tala whiki halo to. Tauwhinga ia. Why? Because these to taonga ia, hado toru ni mua mai hakwe tapu he umu, around the umu space. So we see Jesus ministering in that particular environment. So in the Niue aesthetics also we find in ethnomusicology. Now, ethnomusicology is to do with singing. We have a kind of a unique culture with similarities to our cousins. So singing for me is like language, and language is a vaka. It's a vessel carrying our taonga. And for us in diaspora in Australia, you know, koe lolongo, koe mena mua atu I mahuinga e lolongo ke hito whanau niue hinei. Fia lo tolu ke lolongo, fia lo tolu ke kori. So it's an important part of the Niue aesthetics. I like the work of Stephen Kimbrough. Now, Stephen Kimbrough wrote about the context where hymns comes from. Now, he said that there is a spiritual ethos and a cultural context out of which every Christian hymn or song is born. As the church addresses what it shall sing in the present and future, it must be attentive to the spirituality that gives birth to song. So for Kimbrough, hymns mean more than means of praising God. It means more than praising God. It also it carries identity. It carries world views. It carries our epistemology. So singing is a cultural vessel for you know, not just for the gospel of Jesus Christ, but also for our identity as Niueans as we're living in diaspora. So they carry the vital pulse of the spiritual ethos and theology of us Niueans, and those who author and compose these songs from way back, and even to us who do compositions today. These compositions, these words come from somewhere. They don't just, you know, they give them more malanga. Kai hake mai he to uho toka, he to mana tuanga. Tupu mai he to waka ne tupu gilalo. Ke whan liu mo tu atu ki tua ki tautu puna tautu mo to Tupumaiaga tautu. So the songs and you know, the ethnomusicology, I think, brings in my studies an awareness to. It's important for us as Niueans living abroad to have an understanding. Now I can go on and on and on, but I'm going to cut it off short by saying that what does it mean for us today? So my thesis offer a particular kind of ecclesiology. As I wrote my thesis, I was a minister at Carlton Ramsgate. Now, I really admire my members there and the leadership there, because a lot of things that I wrote about, we practiced. And some of the songs and things we did in church may be not acceptable in a traditional Niuean setting. For example, for every big event, we have a traditional welcome, a Niuean welcome. Bakalanga, hahaya tamayanga, he te whakau ki loto me te akwaku ki loto whaitung, haie te riko kaune hau, talangi, all that jazz. We did that. And one time, we did a takalo. Now, I know there's a big debate about takalo at funerals and things like that on social media, but we did a takalo in church, and my young people were reluctant. They looked at me and said, we're more in you know, study history, study your history. What is a takalo? When and how was the takalo used? Takalo was a spiritual exercise. It's a spiritual exercise. It's an invocation of the spirits to aid the warriors as they prepare to go to war, to go to battle. That's the root of the takalo. Now, the night before, they will build a fire for kieto, the fumamala, the langi ki lo tolo to tau. Now, that's poisonous. And in and around that fire, they would dance, they would do the takalo, they would do the chants. Now, the tauratu would do that on behalf of the warriors, and they will go into a trance. And in that trance, then they become invisible. When they go to battle, they have no fear. Why? Because what they've done is spiritual. Now, contextualizing the gospel to particular cultures is important. What did Paul say? Whānau Paulo, we kisia ia e tūla ne aiwha hingo ne tohia. Tagata Pulotu he Tagata Pulotu. Si whakaonga e tūla ia. Ke pehe koe tūla he tua de naka kisia. Is it the altar of the living God? Now contextualizing the gospel, planting, transplanting. Now it's one thing to take a faith and a Christianity and say, hey, I should make a hick. Why? We are practicing the way of the Palami, the people who brought that gospel. If we contextualize the essence, what is the essence of the gospel? And look at our culture, look at our language. Ko ingo to kupu niue, ai ko kupu whakalofa, ai kupu tamai kupu whakalofa. Ai tamai he loto ke lisiano kupu whakalofa. Kupu whakalofa, tupu hakini whanau ni mo niue. And so the people know what love is. Christianity affirms that it is the love of God. It is like, for example, the light. We have the light in the morning. All right, and we know light is good, but only when the sun rises over the horizon, we say that's the source of light. That's the source of light. Christianity, for me, is like that. Kofita e longona mkisia he tangata niue e mama. There were words of kalofa, words of whakamangalo, words. There are values that were in there. Now Christianity brought and confirmed and affirmed our understanding that there is a God, there's a creator God, and that creator God is embodied in Jesus Christ, brought to us by the Bible, and that is who we are as a church. As a Niueans, how can we embody the gospel values in our own language, in our own dances, in our own songs, genres, that is particular to Niue. We have a lot of young people go to different types of churches because they enjoy the Western style of music. Can we create and popularize Niueans hymns? We don't lose that. Or Samoans or Tongans or Fijians, whoever you are. When we contextualize the gospel, the incarnation, the doctrine of incarnation, where God became human, took flesh, and lived among us. Lived among us. Kai ke whakatupu tua ke motu, sigeni ke motu nei ko Australia ne nofo ia, whakaonga to koroha do tūru, ke talahaua ki whinangaro me whakaalofa hea tua, si wā te muruina. I think I could go on and on and on, and my brothers and sisters, but I think that's enough for me. I'm guessing you have a lot of questions, so I'm going to hand it over to you, and I will try my best. Thank you.
Oelahi ma tua whakawhikau. Mga hone tuku atu ki am tōru ne manako ke whaihuhu. But looking in the chat group over here, I think Nuhi had put up a comment about the idea of collective reading. She likes it, or she's interested, and rather than being individual reading, as this is counter to the tufunga who are knowledge holders, and as such kept that within the confines of the family and passed only within the family. Nuhi, are you there? Do you want to elaborate more on that?
Yeah, but before I move to that, Matagi, thank you for discussing your PhD thesis with us tonight. There's some interesting bits in it that I've enjoyed listening to. But I suppose one of the first questions I really want to ask is, what were some of the outcomes of your research? Did you interview the Niueans about, that's something I would really like to hear and to understand. What were their thoughts on your research? What was some of the outcomes of your research from the interviews and from the people that you talked to? Are you able to share some of that?
Yeah, thank you, Nuhi. I don't have a record of materials that I research apart from my personal one. This is not an exercise, scientific research, so to speak, but a exercise of theology and ecclesiology, which looks at our cultural practices, our social activities, and our received traditions, and then make sense of that, and also shape what our diasporic church might look like that serves not just the faith, but also our identity as Niuean. So this exercise is not.
So it wasn't empirical? So the research, okay, so it was literature based.
Yes.
Okay.
Oral, which includes oral tradition. It's something that now, Nuhis, this is not something that I've just done in the last few years. I've done this in the last 20 odd years. In fact, my first thesis with the Umu theology was done at Otago University when I did my Bachelor of Theology with honors. And it is not a empirical study.
Okay, thank you for that. So that's good to understand, because I thought it was an empirical study, hence my questions around, what others might have said in your research study, people that you may have interviewed, but that's okay. So I just wanted to come up to my comment when you talked about that maybe we should, rather than have individual readings and individual perspectives of history or whatever we're reading, that we should maybe look at it collectively. And I suppose my question in that was that's a little bit counter to the fact that we had Tufunga in Niue who were our knowledge holders, and as such they kept that knowledge within them, within the confines of the family, and then only passed it within the family. So I suppose I'm just saying here that I'm not agreeing with that particular point that you were making, because we've had people in our own societies who held on to knowledge and still hold on to knowledge. I also just wanted, while I'm speaking, I'll just try and get through my questions. I wanted to just say too, around the umu concept. So one of the things that I did post here was that many children born in the diaspora now, and in New Zealand in particular, there's about four, nearly 5 generations of children being born in New Zealand. And I know that within my own family, because we migrated very early on, in the late 50s and 60s, as these 5 generations born in New Zealand. We're multi-ethnic. And as such, one of the things that has happened in my own family is that the idea of the umu that we were exposed to, and I was exposed to that because we were fortunate enough that when we arrived in New Zealand, we were there with our grandparents and our families, and we were taught how to make the umu, and so the conversations around that, we're familiar with that. Now our children and our grandchildren, and in my particular family, extended family also, they aren't familiar with that concept because they haven't had the opportunity. And so I suppose, I suppose there is a question in there. It's more a comment. I'm just commenting on the fact that, lots of our children will not be exposed to some of these things, and how can we teach them? Of course, we now have workshops on umu in New Zealand too. You have to get a permit to have an umu. Everyone's forgotten how to do an umu, so there's a whole lot of issues around it. But I do understand that concept and what you're trying to to say, because there was a lot of, you know, the social activity. It brought a lot of family together, and the preparation and the discussion. That doesn't happen in my family anymore because we cater now. But anyway, I just wanted to make that comment.
That's great. Well, there are two things you're asking here. One is a collective reading versus an individual reading. Now, you brought up an example of, say, the way Niue, what I'm saying here, I'm not stating a fact to say that that's how we do it. What I'm saying is I'm suggesting that we need to start evolving. Why? Firstly, koe toko whiha me toko ngā hoa whakahanga I tau Niue. Koe puhala tua I tau ne behe, toko ne kolo hako ke lato me mga wā hako. And I know of a few families. I worked in Australia for 12 years. And I know of a few families who have lost their taonga because they did not wish to share it. Whauru he tō mga whaua ia, ne tahani e koroa ne toka hifo, tahe tāmaka ne tauwhi ke koroa ia, kakarola he tō koroa whangaru. I mean, even my wife's family, tau iningini was koe whiwhine tau si loi. Ai roa whai tāma na kai, whai mokopuna na kai ne tūtaki, who continue on with that tradition. Why? Because we were adamant in keeping that tradition and that information to ourselves. So what I'm advocating here is to help our community to say, now let's open up and save our taonga. I used to work in the education department when I first went back to Niue as a graphic designer. And I used to illustrate, I organized, help organize workshops on material and resources for teaching. So I would record them, I would draw a lot of things. And some of the matua ni mai me talhau de talhawanga tuai halotul talang e o de whakasino. Now they were brave enough to share, and those things are now preserved. Tolonga te whanau he te matua pehenei, haiosi New Zealand, Australia, they cannot practice that because you require materials and resources back home. And mai ai ta ofi e ta koroia ngaro whakosi. So I'm advocating that we do collect. It's not just, there's one part. One part is about that particular type of information. What I'm actually saying here is about communal reading. It is about interpretation. That you don't just have one individual interpreting, but you have a community interpreting, bringing ideas together. This is how we read it. And together, you know, we get a picture, a full picture, rather than just one individual doing it. So as a researcher, you know, I do things, but I advocate for other people to do it as well. So the more perspectives we find, the better informed we are. Secondly, the second, third, fourth, fifth generation multi-ethnic grandchildren that we do have, I have 6. Now 4 of them have a bit of Māori, have a bit of Palangi in them. And I encourage them to teach them. You know, we need to be intentional in the way that we teach our children and provide the opportunity. But what is an equivalent? I wrote an article that is now published in a book by Shone Haver, and it is about the moving umu. In other words, that it's not just about the umu per se, but the means of fellowship, the means of coming together. Now, there's an example I used by saying that we don't do umu here anymore, but we bring food, potluck dinner. And in that time, now I still call that an umu space because it involves eating and fellowship. It's an umu space. But we do need to be intentional in teaching. If that's the way of perpetuating our values as Christians and as our values as a culture, then we need to be intentional. Thanks, Nuhi.
I think Janice has got a question, and after Janice will be Ina. Janice, do you want to elaborate more on your question that you've put up in the chat? Go ahead. Janice, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, whakalopalaia to everybody. Yeah, I love that in terms of doing things as a collective and as a whole. I think sometimes we have knowledge holders that hold on to things, and different families end up doing things. So I think the collective is a good thing. I guess some of my observations are in terms of whether or not the knowledge becomes watered down in an essence or in a sense, and we've seen that happen with discussions around the takalo not being performed at the cemetery, and now we've seen it performed at the cemetery. So I guess that's kind of the observations and where I'm coming from. Not saying that it's watered down or anything, but just sometimes when the knowledge gets passed from one generation to another, it may get interpreted a certain way if we don't have those matuas teaching us or guiding us in an essence. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. That's a great observation. First and foremost, everything that is passed down will eventually change. I don't know if you've seen an exercise, a social exercise, where a line of people stand face to back, and then someone would do a sign to the one in front, and then the next one tap the shoulder of the one in front and turn around and show. At the end, this difference changed. It's very similar. It's a classic example of what we pass down. Now, trying our very best to hold on to the essence. I remember those who were manawa, there is this traditional medicine using coconut and fern roots. And he showed me, and I tried, and the glass bottle I used exploded. Now, obviously, I've done something wrong, right? Because I probably added too much roots into the mix. So what I'm saying is that nothing that passed down from those before us will ever be pure, like what that is. Always be a chance of mutating and changing as it goes. But the main thing is to make sure that the instructions are well kept. Now, the advantage, imagine if it wasn't just me, if my sister was there listening to our grandfather, or a cousin, 3 of us. Now, collectively, we will be much, much stronger in our record, in our practice, because there were many of us. And I think it's the same principle that we can use. Now, I'm not saying that this is how it is. I'm saying this is how it should be. And we need to think about preserving a lot of our power.
Koe, Ina, ko whea koe? Whai huhu rai ga ne manaku ge. Huhu?
Mine was actually just a statement following on from what Nuhi mentioned earlier about the knowledge that's shared, because from what I know from back home, that there's certain knowledge that's shared within the matawa, your family. There's certain knowledge that's kept within villages, because we may do things differently, and there's the common knowledge that we would hold as a mutu. So for example, something like knowing how to make a kakapapola, that's common knowledge. But things like Seve-Williams, that's kept within Ethnomusicology, because I'm talking to some of the mamatuas who do practice that there's an element of spirituality in that itself, that there are whakapapa, and then they don't, it might be one person, because Daiki ke whaimana ka hako, there's something that's done that isn't right, or you give instructions to someone who's taking your medicine and they don't follow those instructions. Something happens to that person and the person who made the medicine. And some people might say, oh no, that's just superstition. But they follow the and that's why sometimes they don't want to just give it out to everyone. But then there's also a manako ki levek, because I don't know whether it's thinking in Western terms that our knowledge will be exploited by others for financial benefits. But if it's something to help and improve, and I know that with the whole healing process that we use, some families take their children back to Niue. So we're having to adapt some of our cultural practices to deal with what's readily available. But mitaki ke whakamauhefo, ako hai ke whakamauhefo, especially if it's with the family, and how can we use knowledge, because there's always that kind of, you hold back because you don't want it to be exploited by others. And I think most of my best learning has always been either on the plantation or in Tukuitonga. And like you said, that when everyone kind of becomes equal, and us little ones, but ears are always, listening out, being very observant, and listening to the funny stories we hear, and then we interpret it in our own way. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna do go.
Thank you. I don't want to talk about Waki, but I heard a little bit about the Koloa Magafawa. I agree totally. Na haya do mena hakolata ke ilo alolahi. Haya do mena kolata ke ilo ni whaka Magafawa. But in terms of family, na hamahani hake toko taha mai Magafawa ke uta. E koloia kai lolahi to koloia kwa ngalo te mga me. That's a fact. The fact that is the majority of our town are gone. I just wish that, for example, a family can sit down with not just one, but perhaps a few who will explain that. And for mama ngi foki not go over anoa ki faf kai leve ki whakamalafoa. Now, there are things that we do need to do that. I'm not saying in my thesis that everybody should share all the secrets. No. On the contrary, I think that there are certain things that tapu, once upon a time, I used someone's way. What did you do? And I explained to him. And he said, so there are certain things that we need to observe. But it's true, it's important that we do observe these sorts of things. It comes with tapu, it comes with some sense of sacredness that attach to that practice. But there are certain things. Maybe in the 1970s or 80s, Tamafuata Whanaki Samoa, the for Kisiang, Iloi Patu Tahawai, Manga year, Ute Patu Migamerica, Monose, Watau Missionary Han, see Nahua is a pharmacist and produce some sort of medicine out of that. Now, the question then is who benefit, who benefit from that medicine in terms of financial benefit. So to be here and the other thing also is that I saw a post the other day about takihi, someone making a takihi online, and there were comments about Kolata Matagi, Kisi, Kolata Matagi, you know, there's certain ways of doing, different people have different ways. Now there are all kinds of things that we think, should we share or should we just keep it within the family? But I must say there's a warning. Make sure that taonga remain vital in your family or community. We need to look at how to best, you know, keep that and retain that traditional knowledge. Because we lost too many already. So we need to find a way to retain some of the traditional knowledge. I'm long on the Taval Hauhiumu, but I think it's yeah. Thanks, you.
Tukuitonga mga honegi a ma Carlos. Whai manatua Carlos ko tuku hake moe he chat he the Carlos, over to you. Go ahead.
It was just can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Just a comment, because like we're talking about maintaining traditions, and I guess as mentioned earlier in this presentation that everyone is pretty much a king in their own household, but then who then ensures that we as a people adhere to these traditions that we're supposedly trying to maintain? That would be my only, because I guess that's why we see the youth doing what we do, and people have take issue with it, but then who then corrects us? Or yeah, that's my only thing, is like the lack of traditional leadership, I guess, because it's not like we live in a village setting where there are leadership positions or leadership in place. I guess then we would then rely heavily on the church, but then as the stats show that we are moving away, and yeah, it's just a, you know, I don't know what the answer is. Hello?
Thanks, Carlos. That's a very, very important question. It is to do with social structures. When I say everyone's a king in their own household, I'm just saying that because it's quite true. The attitude, I speak to the attitude, but we do have some social structure. We do have a leveki mawhawa, even though it's not so apparent in terms of practice. It's only to do with land issues when that kind of thing comes up. But in terms of ensuring that the values are kept, the families are informed, held together, that's not really happening. The social structure, the tolu in Niue, koe maanga, koe haia e akwako, haia e urumotua, haia e kepure, haia e leoreo, kai ko leoreo. In communities who continue to hold on to that kind of structure, they thrive. I mean, if you look around the Niue at the moment, the social cohesion in some villages are very apparent because they try to keep that structure in place. And I'm not gonna as an example. And if you Hakupu people out there listening, good on you. You know, that if you look at Hakupu today, the way they do things, their social structure is quite in place. They have you know, the reverence for the minister, and the minister needs to do the right thing. And they all work together. All work together to ensure that the community operates in a cohesive and unite together as a community. So that's one. In diaspora, again, when I mentioned in my thesis, the church is often that place. And that's one of the reasons why I found when I was in Ramsgate that some of the Niuean young people come to churches to look for that, to find a place where they can learn the language and learn about their culture and about themselves, their identity. But the church needs to resource itself. We need to intentionally find a way to resource ourselves. And for me, I don't just stick with our own, but I also look at other people around the community and pull them in to support what we do. Sometimes, at one time, I actually called New Zealand. We have Sam, Lisi, Lecky, Bob, Jackson, you know, so I look to come and provide some support and resources to our young people, for example. But I also look beyond our church community to come and hold workshops. So there are leaders and resources around, but it's the way to go about it. I think it's important. We need to be very mindful.
Tuku atu mga hone kia e pusimani. Yeah, I saw you wanted to ask a question or.
It's just a comment. I know we can all get caught up in the practice of life, in the example of umu and the questions Nuhi raises and that Carlos raises are extremely important. And I just wanted to make the comment again that the theology of Dr. Matangi's thesis and the example of the umu and social aspects around umu really helps to engage individuals. No age, there's no exceptions when it comes to age or generations, in my view. Seeing some of Matangi's work in the physical at Ramsgate Church. And you have young babies up to Doru Motua, all engaged. And so the actual action part of it, there's so many theses that you think, firstly, can't understand the English in that. How is that helpful to the common man? But so there's so many gems in this thesis. Not that I've read the thesis, but I know his work or have observed their work, him and Joe's work at Ramsgate and other congregations, and hearing him speak about part of this thesis, I can see both the academia part of it as well as the practice. And isn't that what we are required to do as so-called academics, those who call themselves academics, is to make it basic and simple for at every level. I'm not saying not to have the quality, of course, that's the expectation of the system that we operate in. But please hear my heart. And what I'm saying is it's just so lovely to see a piece of thesis, PhD work, that it actually makes sense to the common person as well as every other level in between. And isn't, it really prompts me to think about and what we do he to alaala ahongofuru api he tukaina, to give homage to those who have passed in this life, is to capture that. I'm sure there are studies, but just the spirit of what Matangi is saying, and as he says it, as he describes it, I think that perhaps there could be more study in the area of how we farewell those from this life, and the same kind of very similar concepts, and attribute or connect it to the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the practices. But isn't it, at the end of the day, isn't our response to be that, thank you, God, for being who you are and having this amazing plan, that yes, we are uniquely Niue, and we're also part of your plan of sanctification in life, redemption, of course, sanctification in life. And in the end, we return to that dust, that efu, and I would love to see studies on that part, on how we farewell our loved ones from this life, knowing in faith, and as the word, which is unchangeable, the only one thing that's unchangeable, the word of God that says, this is where you're coming to. Some comments, lots of comments. I hope that triggers thoughts for discussion now and in future.
Thank you, Nate. As you speak, Nate, I just want to say that I remember what I said earlier on about Takalo in church. And I don't want people to think that we did a ko motoru te ngā take tangata. No, the kalo we use as a genre to do an invocation, a prayer of invocation, which was designed especially as a prayer of invocation, invoking the Holy Spirit to come into the congregation and lead us and fill us. So that was the context. Thanks, you.
Or any comments to be added to our whakatutalang he whiawhine? Ai whai ga? Ka eke ko ai whai, whakau e lahi, tuku atu tau manatu whakau e matua whakawhikau hakwa talia whiawhia ke moa e mga aho ke tūtala mai whala mai e hau tau pulotu mai tau roto matala. Kai mai honei tuku atu ke he tahata kita ke mai he Tupumaiaga Trust ke whakausi tau tolu. Final remarks from Zora Feilo from the Tupumaiaga Trust. Ka osi ia si tuku atu kia inga mokole ke whakausi ia tau tolu ke he liung whakaue.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'd just like to say a few words on behalf of the Tupumaiaga Niue Trust. Thank you for joining us in the Pulotu talks today, Reverend, and Eo for organising. Thank you for everyone who's participated today, and we've really enjoyed the talks today. Just these few words, give thanks. Koe nei.
Thank you. Yo, before we finish, can I just say one thing? Thank you firstly for inviting me to be part of this webinar. And thank you to all the brothers and sisters who are on board. And if you have any other questions, feel free to drop me a line and to ask or have a conversation one-on-one. But thank you for the opportunity to share some of the things. As I said, if you want to access the thesis, go to Charles Sturt University website, go to theses and just type in my name and it should show up. Just click on that and you can download it, I think. Otherwise, contact me directly and I can forward you a copy. And lastly, there is a title that we've struggled with since 2015. Someone called me all sorts of names as to koe ke kafo, koe Tagata Pulotu, all sorts of things. And in Niue, I had a discussion with Sifa, who is the chair of the Niue Language Commission. And we haven't had that title in Niuean before. So there is a title that we now use. It's called Tui Pulotu, which is to do with the crowning tui, and also wearing, that qualification, and also comes with a sense of responsibility, to educate and to share and to facilitate knowledge. So Tui Pulotu, I think, is what my community is using at the moment, and so is Niue. To my fellow Australians, God bless you. Go New South Wales. Sorry, Queenslanders.
Go elahi. Tō tuku atu ke whakausi e matua whakatau he tolu koenga tō tolu ki a whiawhinei. Next week, we have Coral Pasisi, who will be talking about climate change from Niue. And also the following week, we'll have Cora Allen Wycliffe, who will be speaking on hiapo making. So we're looking forward to hearing their presentation in the weeks ahead. Whakau elahi, tuku atu ki a koe mai.
Whakau elahi. ko ila ke he tau pulotu ki he whiawhi. Mo tau eki ngā hua ha tau tūru, riongia tau tōru. Kua whetuyanga mau tōru e tua ki ngā honei ha koe tau pulotu. Kua tufa ai, mo lafi ai, mo laku ai e mau tōru koe tua ke la taia, mo ha mau tōru e tau mo mui. Kaue ki he pulotu, mo lauta matala koe tua nei. Whakamunina mai, ki he whiawhi, pihia mo e wahata puni ha mau tōru ki ai, mo a mamanaki koe tua, ke liu ke matala mai e furola, e manongi, e fisila kau, koe pulotu. Kua ole me whakatoko lalo atu mau tūru ki ai. Amene.